Okay, here we are again with Logic Pro X, and let's do some more. And thanks for the kind comments, by the way, that people left. That was really nice. Thanks for those, and it's good to be back. So here we are with Logic Pro X, and since the last tutorial there's been an update, and we're on 10.02 now. Okay, and what we're going to look at is this new feature in Logic Pro X or Logic Pro 10 called track stacks. Okay, and these are a massively important part of the new Logic because it changes potentially the whole way that you work with Logic in terms of the tracks and their relationship to the mixer, organising the mixer, all sorts of things, right? So that's what we're going to look at. Track stacks, which is a new feature that, to be honest, mostly engineers are talking about, but beginners are not really. Beginners are being punted the big new features, you know, the new drummer. In Logic Pro X, it automatically plays drums for you, allowing you to just get on and write your songs. You know, the new smart controls. You don't need to know anything in the new Logic Pro. Just move these easy controls and blah 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 blah. And you know, the new synth and the new bass amps and the new, you know, and one thing I forgot to mention, the new flex pitch. You know, the new flex pitch allows you to automatically correct pitch errors in your singing, playing, whatever, blah blah. That's what's being punted. For beginners, these big new obvious features, but the track stacks, whilst being a massively important part of the new Logic, they're not being talked about so much because it's more an engineer's thing. And I've watched a few so-called tutorials out there for track stacks, and because they're not being done by a person who's an experienced engineer, they're pretty hopeless, to be honest. Okay, so it's a lot deeper than the tutorials out there show. Track stacks, that's what we're going to do, and it's going to be a big one, this, because there's a lot to look at. It's going to be a couple of hours, right? But you like it like that, don't you? Look, if you don't know my tutorials, I'm an old engineer and I do these long in-depth tutorials. I relate things to real engineering techniques, blah blah blah. That's how it is, so buckle up, because it's a long one, this, okay? But you'll get to know the full Monty about these track stacks. Okay, but before we get going, as I said, we're on 10.02 now, which has fixed one bug, which is that if you assign the right mouse to the toolbox now, then with this 10.02 update, it now works in Piano Edit. So I'm going to switch my mouse so that the right click opens the toolbox, because that's how I have it, and that's how I had it for all the other Logic Pro tutorials. Now normally we do that in Logic Pro Preferences, General Editing there, but it's missing. The right mouse click parameters options should be here, and they're missing. And what we need to do is we go to the advanced here, right? And when we put Logic into the advanced mode, extra advanced options become available, and we want to tick advanced editing. Okay, now we go to general editing, and there's the right mouse button options. Okay, and I can switch it from the default shortcut menu to tool menu. Okay, now, yeah, I've got me right click for the tools. Okay, which now also works in Piano Edit. Now there are other options for the right mouse tool, right? But we've been into all this with the Logic 9 tutorials I did. Nothing's changed. Logic 10 is just the same for everything I taught. So if you want to know more about this, go and watch the old tutorials. Okay. Okay, now I've got the right mouse bringing up my toolbox. But when you get it, when you set your Logic like that, if you want to, and it works like that in Piano Edit, yeah. If you set your mouse like that, then to get the shortcut menu, you've got to do Control left click, yeah, and on a region. Control left click to bring up the region shortcut menu, etc. Okay. Okay. Right, track stacks. Let's get into them now. We're doing them because A, it's a massively important part of the new Logic. B, you have to at least understand them, because if you don't, you're going to be in a world of hurt, because when you begin using this Logic Pro, even though track stacks is a more advanced engineering concept on a deeper level, you're going to be forced to deal with these track stacks as soon as you begin to use Logic, even in a very basic way, right? And thirdly, these track stacks directly relate to a previous tutorial that I did about grouping tracks or grouping channel strips in the mixer. Okay, in earlier tutorials I went into explaining the whole concept of channel strips and channel strip presets and what they are and how they relate to tracks and how they relate to the library and how those track channel strips all arrange themselves in the mixer and things you can do with them. And one of the things I spent a lot of time explaining was the concept of grouping channels, and that directly relates to these track stacks. So I suggest you watch the old tutorials. I'll put up a link, there it is, to the old tutorial all about the concept of instrument channel strips, which includes grouping channels in the mixer and what grouping is. Go and watch it. Okay, I'll put a link down in the description box on YouTube as well to the old tutorial that includes everything about grouping channel strips, right? Now these track stacks directly relate to grouping, which is a massively important part of engineering technique. Okay, so let's get on with it, and to keep this tutorial self-contained, we'll briefly explain again what the concept of grouping is as an engineering technique. Now, I've got an audio track set up already, a blank one. Watch this. I open my browser. Okay, put it to project. And this is how easy it is to bring a bunch of audio files into your current project. You just open your browser on project, find the files in your Explorer, drag and drop them into the project column. Then you highlight using command and left click the track, or rather the files that you want to import into your sum. Drag and drop them onto the workspace, let go, make sure you set this to create new track, so it creates a new track for each file. And okay, one of the files I'm importing has got tempo information, so I won't import it. And there we have it. That's how easy it is to get audio files into your current project. Just drag and drop them into the project column and then drag and drop the ones you want onto the track. Logic creates tracks for them and you're ready to go. I'll delete this empty audio track now. Okay, so grouping. Let's look at that first. Just quickly remind ourselves what it is, and then we can see how it relates to track stacks. What I've got here is 4 brass tracks. Okay, well, it's an impression of 4 brass tracks. You'll see what I mean in a minute. Right. Well, I've got a baritone sax, I've got a tenor sax, I've got a trombone, and a trumpet. There they are. And they're each on their own track. So the way I recorded this was I put a mic on every instrument. Yeah, there'd be spillage from the others, but they're not standing around a stereo pair of mics all playing into a stereo track. I've recorded each instrument in the brass section on its own track, using its own mic. And although there'll be a bit of spillage, when I finish I get a recording of each brass instrument on its own track, and I can balance them exactly how I like, either on their faders here or on their volume controls on their tracks. Okay, now I didn't have time to set up a sampler for each type of brass instrument and write a pattern, then write all the harmony patterns and then render them, bounce them down to audio files and set it all up like that. I just wanted a quick fix to show you this concept of grouping. Okay, so I sang in the brass harmonies, right? I sang them in like an impression. You know, like when you're down the pub, you know, and some bloke's going, "Oh, mate, remember that old song? And it had that sax solo that went," and you sing. Do you know what I mean? You sing an impression of the instrument. Well, that's what I've done here to save time. Okay, so here's my impression of a brass section, baritone, tenor, trombone and trumpet, playing a harmony riff, which is an old soul riff. Right, here we go, no laughing, here we go. Oh yeah. Okay. Wow. Fantastic. Okay, but look, it'll do for what we want. Okay, now before we go on, I'm going to colour my output and master in the mixer brown. I would like to make them grey, but brown is the most horriblest colour to me. So if I make them brown, then I know everything else in the mixer with a colour relates to a track. It's a channel strip for a track on the track header column. Okay. or it makes it easier to see that. And the other thing we're going to do is we bring up the shortcut menu on any track header. Make sure that show track numbers is ticked, so you get these numbers, look, next to each track like that, these number boxes showing the track number. And then again bring up the shortcut menu on any track header and make sure under track header components that show track color bars is ticked. So show track color bars, and then the color bars on the tracks appear, and you can easily see the relationship between tracks and their channel strips in the mixer by color. Okay, right. Now, here's my 4 brass instruments on their own tracks, and they're all currently routed on to the stereo out. Look, here's the output row across here. Stereo out for each one. So each audio track channel strip is going to the final stereo out. Okay, grouping. Watch this. I use command left click and bring the channel strips for the 4 brass instruments into a selection so they're all highlighted, and then if I change a parameter on one, it changes that same parameter on all of the highlighted channel strips in the selection. So on their output row there, I'm going to change them all so they're not assigned to the stereo out anymore, but they're assigned to the first available bus, which is bus 1. Done. Logic creates an auxiliary return receiving on that bus. Okay, so I can now call this brass group, and all created auxiliaries are lime green, by the way, and they live down the end of the mixer in front of the output and master. So now we have a stereo group bus, and the 4 channel strips for the 4 brass instruments are now routed to it, so their audio outs are all going to this stereo group, and then from there on to the final output. So the brass is now grouped on this stereo fader. The audio outs from all the brass channel strips are feeding through this stereo group fader, so I can control all the brass instruments as a stereo group. Okay, that's called grouping. And we group instruments of the same type to a stereo or mono bus, so we can easily adjust the level of that collection of instruments, and we normally group things that are all the same, so we group all our brass instruments to a single stereo group bus, so we can control our brass as a stereo group. We group all our backing vocals, so we have them all on a stereo bus as a stereo backing group. We group all the individual drum outputs or drum mics in a drum kit to a stereo group, so we can control the whole kit as a stereo group. Okay. Grouping selections of channels for tracks that are in the same category or part of the same collection allows us to control them easily as a stereo or mono group, raising or lowering their level as a collection of tracks, as a group, relative to the other sections in the arrangement. Okay. Now inside a group you can individually adjust the levels as well as anything else for those individual tracks and channel strips inside the group. But the point is they're all grouped to a bus as a group. Okay, now not only can they be controlled in level as a group, but you can strap processors across them. So you could add a final EQ to the overall group of brass. Or you could compress them all as a group so that they're all forced into the same compressor, which has the effect of slightly tightening them up because they're all forced into the same compressor envelope. And you can use that envelope to either do subtle compression that just tightens it up subtly, or drastic, really radical or pumping compression or aggressive compression, whatever you like. Okay. So that's grouping. A bunch of channel strips for instruments of the same type are sent to a bus where they can be controlled and processed as a group. And then the signal from there goes to the final out. Okay. Now this grouping is a massively important part of engineering technique, and it's so fundamental to engineering technique that it goes all the way back to the days of Elvis and people like that, the early days of recording to tape in mono and then stereo when that came in. It's a fundamental part of recording technique that has expanded to become a creative technique. Okay, think about it. This grouping of channels to a bus relates back to the old early days of recording people like Elvis or Fats Domino, you know, Jerry Lee Lewis, all those old guys And in those days, right, there was no multi-tracks. There was none of that business. No doing instruments on different tracks and dropping in and all that. Unless you use really advanced techniques like Phil Spector used to do, maybe of other people, like of bouncing down from one tape machine to another. But in essence, it was about the live take in those days. Okay, you set up all the mics in the studio and all the instruments, mics on the drums, the piano, the guitar, the bass, any backing vocal groups, and of course the lead singer, and then you mix them, all the mics, on a very primitive mixer, no EQ, just levels and routing. So you balance the mics to get the right balance, and then they are all grouped to a single bus, a mono bus, that is then used to adjust the final level going to the mono tape recorder. And then the engineer goes rolling, and the band goes 1, 2, 3, 4, and plays the song through. One live take, which is captured to that mono track, and if they do a really good take, that goes to get made into a record. And then later, when it went to stereo, you simply grouped all the mic channels in the studio down to a stereo group bus, which would then be used to adjust the final level going to a stereo tape machine, right? And then later on, at the end of the 60s, when we went to 4-track recording around the time of Sgt. Pepper, you would then mix all the mics in the studio down to either 4 mono buses feeding 4 mono tracks, or a stereo bus feeding a stereo track and a mono bus feeding a mono track, to make a total of 3 tracks recorded, leaving 1 free to bounce down to, and then add your next overdub with the next with the bounce, etc. However you were working, but with 4 tracks, the mics in the studio would be grouped down to any of the 4 tracks in different combinations. So this whole thing of grouping originates with grouping channels for mics in the studio to buses to feed tape tracks. Okay, because it's easier to adjust the final bus, the group bus, to a tape than to go and adjust every individual fader to make everything in the mix slightly lower while keeping the relative levels between the faders correct. You can just lower and raise the entire final group of mic channels going to the tape to get the level you want on tape once you've got the mix. Right? So that's where it comes from. Grouping comes from routing collections of mics to tape tracks, and then when we went 8-track it expanded, and 16-track, 24-track it just expanded. But we can use this grouping for creative techniques as well. Okay. And you always use grouping when you're working live, to group your drum kit and group your backing vocals and group your brass, etc., so you can quickly reach out and adjust the level of that group of instruments, like adjust your kit up or down really quickly. And if you're doing film score, again, you group your strings, you group your horns, you group your whatever. Okay. That is the concept of grouping, and as I say, it's a massively important part of engineering technique. So we set up a manual group on these 4 brass channel strips. We highlighted them all, we assigned them all out to the first available bus. The auxiliary is created receiving on that bus, so they're all now on this group. So the signal from the 4 brass channel strips feeds through this group bus and then off to the final mix. That's grouping. And when we manually group a bunch of channel strips, send them to a bus, that group bus is always created down at the end of the mixer by the output of master, and it's lime green. Alright, let's put it back how it was. Highlight the 4 track channel strips, send them all back to the final out. They're now going to this final out, and they're no longer going through this bus. Delete the bus. And we're back where we started, with the 4 channel strips for the brass feeding to the final out. Okay. Right, now that's grouping as a concept, and as I say, go and watch the old tutorial, because it relates it all to what channel strip presets are, etc. But that concept of grouping, which is a massive part of engineering technique, directly relates to these track stacks. I'll show you. Okay. Because you might think, well, that was a nice little story. And, I think I can see this concept of grouping. I'm a beginner, and it looks all good and everything, but, as the guy said, it's an advanced technique. Engineers really are talking about it. It's an engineering tingling, and I'm a beginner. I'll deal with that further down the line, but you have to deal with it now, because Logic's going to foist these track stacks on you, whether you want to deal with them or not. Okay, so let's see how this grouping concept relates to track stacks. Right, I showed you how to group the 4 channel strips for the 4 tracks manually. Okay, now watch this. Highlight all the tracks, bring up the shortcut menu, create track stack. Boom. What type of track stack do you want to create? Well, you can create a summing stack, and you can drop the details down. It gives you a description. Or you can create a folder stack. But the descriptions are really terrible for beginners. So we're going to go for a summing track stack. We're going to put these 4 tracks I've highlighted into a summing track stack. Boom, create. And what's happened? Well, if we look, the summing track stack header has been created. There it is, and it wraps around the tracks that I put into the stack. So they're contained now inside this summing track stack header. Look what's happened in the mixer. The 4 brass channel strips have been grouped. Look, their outputs are all going to bus 1. They've been grouped to a bus. There's the group bus that they're all being fed to. And the summing track stack header is the track for the group bus. This summing track stack header is the group bus, and everything in the stack has been grouped to that audio bus. So a summing track stack is actually a grouping track stack. Really, that's what it should be called, because it groups the contents automatically to a bus for us. And the track header is the group bus. So now they're grouped. But when you create a summing track stack header and it automatically creates that group for everything in the stack, it puts the group bus in front of all the tracks that are grouped to that group bus in the mixer. It doesn't put the group bus down at the end of the mixer in front of the output and master. It puts it there in front of the channel strips for all the tracks that are inside that stack. So a summing track stack is actually a grouping track stack. It groups everything to a group bus, and it gives that group bus a track. So we can rename this now brass group. Brass group. And this is the stereo bus here. Look. So it means I can automate my brass group now, because this summing track stack header is the group channel, the group bus. So I can automate the volume pan, solo, mute, and of course any insert effects, because it's an audio group bus. It can have effects processors strapped across it. So I can use this group bus track to automate volume for my brass group. I can do automation on the bus, and everything in the group is passing through that bus. So I can do all automation for things like the volume for the group bus, pan, solo, mute, on bypass any effects, and of course I can also automate any group processing effects that are strapped across that bus. Fantastic, right? Now inside the stack I can automate any of the individual tracks, whether audio tracks or instrument tracks or external MIDI tracks. I can automate them to my heart's content. Okay, fantastic. So a summing track stack is a grouping track stack. It groups everything in the stack to a bus. Okay. Now when we compact a stack like this, it compacts down to just the bus. So we're just left with the track header, which is the group bus. Same in the mixer, we just get the bus, our brass group. Okay, now when we compact the stack, on the track area, the contents with the audio or MIDI regions are represented on the summing or group track stack header as a representational graphic block. Okay, this is not a real region. Okay, this is a representational block that represents the contents inside the stack. Okay, so it's not a real region. You cannot drag it in size, but you can move it, and you're simply moving the contents it represents inside. Okay, you can alt and drag off a copy, and you're simply making a copy of the contents inside. You can delete the representational block, and it simply deletes the contents inside it represents. You can do all those kind of things like that. You can cut it, and it cuts the contents inside, etc. There's all sorts of things you can do. You just can't size it. Okay, so there you go. But it's so easy now. with the stack compacted down to just the bus track, the group track, because everything in it's been grouped to this bus. The summing track stack is the group bus, right? With it compacted, I'm just moving around a single region, a representative block, which represents my content inside. So much easier than having to lasso the 4 regions and move them around as a group, like that. And when I'm moving that representational block around, working on my arrangement, I know that's my brass section. It's fantastic. Look at that. Okay. So there you go. That is a summing track stack, and you can see how it relates to grouping, because a summing track stack is a grouping track stack. Groups everything to a group bus, and the track is a group bus. The summing track stack header is a group bus. Okay. Right. So that is a summing track stack. Now, how do we get rid of it? Well, we bring up the shortcut menu on the actual track stack header and flatten it. Flatten stack deletes the stack. Well, it deletes the stack header. So we flatten the stack, and the track header representing the bus deletes, and the tracks are left as they were before. But look what happens in the mixer. Although we deleted the track for the track stack, which took the tracks out of the stack, okay, and deleted the track stack header, which was the summing group bus, in the mixer the routing has remained the same. The 4 audio channel strips for the 4 brass instruments are still routed to the bus. The grouping is still there, and the group bus is still there, but now it's moved down the mixer to live in front of the output and master, where regular auxiliary returns and groups live. So when we flatten a grouping or summing track stack, we simply lose the track header representing the group bus, but inside the mixer the grouping remains the same. The 4 channel strips are still routed to the group bus. Okay, so to get it all back how it was, we highlight all the channel strips, send them back to the stereo out. Now they're not going through the bus anymore, they're just going straight to the stereo output, and we delete the bus. And we're back where we started, with the 4 audio channel strips routed to the final stereo out. Okay. Alright, that's the summing track stack and how to flatten it. Okay, next type of stack. Bring them all into the selection. Bring up the shortcut menu on any of them. Create a track stack, but this time we're going to go for a folder stack. Here we go. Create. Boom. Now the folder type stack is not a grouping stack. It does not group the contents in the stack. Okay, look at their channel strips, they're all still going to the stereo out, they are not grouped to a bus. A folder track stack is simply a little MIDI control track and an associated MIDI control fader. But it lives in front of the stack channel strips that it represents inside the mixer. So we get the stack followed by the channel strips for the tracks in the stack. Okay, now this is a simple MIDI control fader that can be used to simply control the volume, solo and mute for the tracks in the stack as a collection, but they're not a group. They're not routed to a group bus. This track is not an audio bus, and its associated channel strip is not an audio bus. It's a simple control fader that can adjust the volume of all the tracks and their channel strips inside that collection, inside that folder. But that does mean, of course, we can still use it to do really simple automation on the volume for the collection of tracks in the stack, like that. Like that. And also a useful one is that we can only do volume, solo or mute, but mute is useful because it means we can put mutes in to do dubs on collections of tracks that we can put into a folder track, and then do dub automation on them as a collection of tracks, so I can knock them in and out as a collection anytime. So you just fix that up with an echo unit as well, and you're ready to do dubs effects on collections of tracks. Okay. Now, inside the folder type track stack, you can still automate the individual tracks inside, whether they're audio or MIDI or instrument, no problems. So you get full automation inside the stack. But this type of stack is a simple control stack. So all we can do is control the volume, mute and solo for the collection of tracks inside. Okay, now when we compact this type of stack, we still get the representational block with the same rules. that represents the content. So we get easy organisation. Everything is compacted down to a single region with the same rules, and that single region represents the contents inside. You can copy it, you can move it, you can delete it, you can cut it and other things, but you just can't size it. To size the content, go into the stack and size the individual regions inside, whether audio and MIDI, right? Okay, now when we compact this stack in the mixer, we also get just the control fader. So again, I can call this my brass, not group, but brass section, because this header represents the brass section. I can adjust the volume for it as a section, but it's not a group. Inside, everything is still routed to its original destination, in this case the stereo out. But I can control them on this fader for the volume, or on this track, which is the fader for the track for the fader. Right? So the folder type track stack is a simple organisational tool. It allows us to save space in our arrange area and mixer, and simply control the volume of the collection of tracks inside. Inside, they can all be automated through your art's content as usual. Okay, that's a folder type track stack, and it's more of an organisational tool, right? So, well, let's flatten that one as well. On the actual track header, bring up the shortcut menu, flatten it. The track header goes away. In the mixer, the little track folder track fader, folder track stack fader moves down the mixer like that. Just delete it manually. But there's nothing to do to the channel strips for the tracks inside the stack that were in the stack, because they were never grouped. So they're just going to the stereo out as usual. So we're back where we started, with the 4 channel strips for the brass going all to the final stereo out. Okay, and that is track stacks, and you can see how they relate to grouping. The summing type track stack is a grouping stack. It automatically groups the contents for us and creates a bus for them all to be grouped to. Okay, and they're all grouped to it automatically, and then the bus is given a track, which is the summing track stack header. That is how it relates to grouping, this important engineering technique, right? Okay, that's how to create and what the 2 different types of track stack are. Now, just a few other things. How to put things into stacks. Well, you can highlight everything, all the tracks you want to put into a stack, and then put them into a stack. Okay, that's one way to do it. Once they're in the stack, you can drag things out of the stack like that, either individually, undo, or multiples. When you drag something out of a stack, its channel strip is routed back to the stereo output again, or whatever its original destination was. Look, here's these 2 tracks here. Look at their channel strips, they're outside the stack now. They're routed to the final stereo out, but you drag and drop them into this summing stack, which is a grouping stack. Drop them in, and they get automatically grouped to the group bus along with everything else in the stack. So when you drop things into a stack, you get automatic grouping to the bus for anything you drop into a summing stack. Okay, so things can be dragged in either individually, or more than one track can be dragged in at a time. Things can be dragged out of the stack either individually or more than one at a time. And things in the stack can be arranged in any order you like by simply dragging them around. Okay, now another way to create a stack is, let's say you're making a stack for a drum kit. You create an audio track. I'll give it a different colour. You call this kick, it's going to be your first drum mic, and then you put it into a stack, just that track. A summing stack, so that all the drum mics will be grouped to a bus. So we've got one drum track inside a stack, a grouping stack, a summing stack. Call that drum kit or drum group. Okay, now we've got one track inside that stack. Let's give this the same colour. We've got one track inside the stack. We make sure that's assigned to the first drum mic, the kick mic. And then with it highlighted, we just duplicate it 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, however many times that we need drum mics, and then we just go down and name snare, hats, tom 1, or whatever. tom 2, however you're recording your drums. The next one might be overhead left, overhead right, low tom, whatever. And then you simply go down and highlight each track and make sure its input is assigned to the right mic input for the snare, the correct mic input for the hats, the correct mic input for the toms, etc. When it's all done, you save it, and you can load this anytime, ready to record drums. When you record your individual drums on their tracks, you get the individual regions with the kick, snare, hats, etc. in it, and they're all being grouped to a group bus where they can be controlled easily as a stereo group and processed as a stereo group. You can save that and load it anytime, ready to record drums, right? And in the mixer, let's colour them all the same first, hang on. And in the mixer, you get your group bus, followed by all the individual drum outs, like that. And when you compact the stack, you just get the bus representing your stereo drum kit. And on the track header, you just get your stereo drum kit. Easy. But inside, you can adjust all the individual drum levels, automate them all individually, but you can automate the bus as well, etc. Right? That's another way to create a stack. Just build it around a single track and then duplicate it as many times as you want that type of track in your stack. You can do all the dragging in and out business. Okay, so there you go. Delete that, and it leaves behind the bus. Delete it. Okay, open up this stack, this summing stack, grouping stack. Let's flatten it. Okay, the routing remains the same. The 4 channel strips are still routed to the group bus. Route them back to the final out. Delete the group bus. We're back where we started. 4 audio tracks going to the final out. Okay, so there you go. That is what track stacks are. Okay. Now, as I said, you might think, well, that's all well and good. It sounds all great and everything. I think I get it. But as the guy said, it's really an engineering technique. I'm a beginner. I don't need to learn that. I'll deal with that further down the line. But you can't. You're going to have to learn it a little bit more, look into it a bit more, because you will have to deal with these track stacks as soon as you begin using this logic in advanced mode, even if you use it in the most basic way. Okay, I'll show you that next. Okay, so I'll see you in a minute for this next bit.